The night Alara Van stopped believing in ordinary choices began without warning, without build-up, and without mercy. Until that evening, her world had been painfully simple. It revolved around narrow hallways, dim hospital lights, and the quiet, relentless sound of machines keeping her mother alive. Every decision she made was measured against a single priority: survival. Not hers, but her mother's. The woman who had once been strong, warm, and unshakably present was now fragile, dependent, and slipping further away with each passing day. Alara had learned to live in restraint. She spoke less than she observed. She trusted less than she understood. There was a sharpness behind her silence, a depth most people overlooked because she never allowed it to surface. To outsiders, she was just another exhausted daughter clinging to hope that was steadily dissolving. But beneath that quiet exterior, something far more complex was waiting. The city itself had always carried an undercurrent of unease. People didn't speak openly about it, but they felt it, in the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned, in the way business owners paid without questioning, in the way fear traveled faster than facts. There were stories, always whispered, never confirmed. Stories about a man who controlled everything without ever being seen. Lucien Drax. His name alone was enough to shift the air in a room. Some called him a myth. Others called him a king. But everyone, without exception, understood one thing: his power was absolute. Alara had heard the name before. Of course, it was impossible not to. But like everyone else, she had treated it as something distant, something that existed in the shadows but never reached into ordinary lives. She was wrong. The hospital corridor was nearly empty when it happened. The late hours had thinned the staff, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet echo of footsteps. Alara had just stepped out of her mother's room, her mind heavy with numbers, medical bills, treatment costs, time she couldn't afford to lose. She never saw them approach. One moment she was walking, the next she was surrounded. No raised voices, no struggle that could attract attention, just controlled, efficient movement. A hand at her arm, another blocking her path. Calm, practiced, absolute. By the time she realized what was happening, it was already too late. The world outside blurred into motion, dark streets, unfamiliar turns, silence that pressed harder than noise ever could. No one spoke to her. No one explained. The absence of chaos made it worse. This wasn't desperation. It wasn't random. It was planned. And she had been expected. When the car finally stopped, Alara didn't resist as she was led inside. Resistance implied misunderstanding. Panic implied weakness. She showed neither. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear, she had learned, was only useful when controlled. The building she entered wasn't loud or extravagant. It didn't need to be. Power didn't announce itself. It settled into spaces and made them unquestionable. She was guided into a room where everything felt deliberate. Every shadow, every piece of furniture, every inch of silence. And then she saw him. Lucien Drax didn't look like the stories. He wasn't surrounded by chaos or violence. There was no visible display of dominance. He didn't need it. He was seated, composed, still. His presence wasn't overwhelming because it was loud. It was overwhelming because it wasn't. There was a precision to him, a restraint that suggested something far more dangerous than impulsive brutality. His eyes didn't search the room. They fixed directly on her, as if she had been the only thing he intended to see. For a moment, nothing happened, and that silence said more than words ever could. Alara stood there, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't challenge him either. She simply existed in that space as if she belonged there. It was the first thing that caught his attention. Most people reacted to him in predictable ways. Fear, defiance, desperation. But she offered none of those. There was something else instead. Something quieter. Something controlled. Something he didn't expect. When he finally spoke, his voice matched everything else about him. Measured, calm, and completely certain. He didn't waste time on explanations. He didn't build tension with threats. He went directly to the point, as if the outcome had already been decided long before she entered the room. Her mother. The word alone shifted something in the air. He spoke of her condition with unsettling accuracy, details no outsider should have known. Treatments, timelines, vulnerabilities. Each word was precise, deliberate, and impossible to dismiss. Ilara felt it then. Not panic, not yet, but a tightening awareness that this was not coincidence. This was control. And then came the ultimatum. There was no dramatic pause, no rise in tone, just a statement delivered with the same calm certainty as everything else. A marriage, her life, bound to his. In exchange, her mother would live, not metaphorically, not eventually, immediately. The terms were clear. The consequences were clearer. If she refused, her mother would not survive the week. The simplicity of it was what made it unbearable. There was no negotiation, no illusion of choice, just a direct equation. Obedience for life, defiance for death. For the first time, something flickered beneath Alara's controlled exterior. Not fear alone, but something deeper, something sharper. Rage, not loud, not explosive, but present. Because this wasn't just a threat. It was a violation of everything she had been fighting to protect. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every quiet moment spent holding on to hope. It was all being reduced to transaction. And yet, she didn't react the way most would. She didn't beg. She didn't collapse. She didn't ask why. Instead, she listened. That was what unsettled Lucian the most. Because in that moment, she wasn't behaving like someone who had just lost control of her life. She was behaving like someone who was processing it, calculating it, understanding it. The imbalance between them was undeniable. He held power. He held leverage. He held the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. But there was something about her stillness that disrupted the simplicity of that equation. She asked no questions. And that, more than anything, suggested she already understood more than she should. Time stretched in that room, thick with unspoken tension. The decision was expected immediately, not because he was impatient, but because he knew most people wouldn't need time. They would break instantly. Ilara didn't. Her thoughts moved quickly, but not chaotically. She didn't focus on injustice. She didn't dwell on the impossibility of the situation. Instead, her mind moved toward something else entirely, something hidden beneath the surface. Because there was one detail she couldn't ignore. He had chosen her, not randomly, not conveniently, specifically. And men like Lucian Drax didn't make choices without reason, which meant this wasn't just about control. It was about something else, something deeper, something that hadn't been revealed yet. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, not submissive, not defiant, just controlled. And in that control, there was a quiet shift in the balance of the room. Small, almost unnoticeable, but real, because in that moment, Lucian realized something he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't going to be simple. Ilara Vance was not reacting like a victim. She was adapting like someone who had been prepared. And preparation implied history. A history he did not yet understand. The decision was made, not with hesitation, not with visible resistance, but with something far more unsettling. Acceptance. She agreed to the marriage. On the surface, it looked like surrender. But beneath that surface, something else had already begun. Because while the room saw a young woman forced into an impossible choice, Ilara Vance was already thinking several steps ahead. And as she stood there, meeting Lucian Drax's gaze without flinching, one truth settled quietly between them. This was not the beginning of her defeat. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. And for the first time, Lucian Drax had chosen someone who wasn't afraid of the consequences, because she already knew something he didn't. Marriage, in its traditional form, was meant to symbolize trust, unity, and choice. But within Lucian Drax's world, it was none of those things. Here, marriage was leverage. It was strategy. It was a binding contract forged not in love, but in power, and one sign it was irreversible. Ilara Vance understood that the moment she accepted, the transition from ultimatum to arrangement happened with unsettling speed. There were no delays, no periods of adjustment, no space for reflection. By the next morning, what had been a private threat became a public declaration, one that rippled through the city with a force stronger than any whispered rumor. Lucian Drax was getting married. The announcement didn't just shock people, it destabilized them. For years, Lucien had remained untouchable not only because of his power, but because of his isolation. He had no visible weaknesses, no emotional ties, no distractions. His control was absolute because it was unshared. And now, suddenly, there was Alara Vance, an unknown name, an untraceable past, a woman who had appeared out of nowhere and secured a position no one else had ever come close to. Speculation spread quickly, but answers did not. People questioned her identity, her origins, her worth. But the more they searched, the less they found. It was as if she had been carefully erased before being deliberately placed back into existence. That alone made her dangerous. But what unsettled them even more was Lucien's decision itself. Because men like Lucien Drax didn't make personal choices. They made calculated moves. And this was something else entirely. Inside his empire, the reaction was quieter, but far more intense. His inner circle did not question him openly. They understood the consequences of that. But silence did not mean acceptance. It meant observation. And everyone was watching Alara. From the moment she entered the Drax estate, she became the center of an unspoken war. The mansion itself stood apart from the rest of the city, not because of its size, but because of its presence. It wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to control. Every entrance was monitored, every corridor calculated, every detail intentional. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a system. Cold, structured, unforgiving. Alara noticed that immediately, but she didn't react to it. She moved through the space with the same quiet composure she had carried into Lucien's presence the night before. No hesitation, no visible discomfort, no curiosity that could be interpreted as weakness. And yet, she was watching everything. Every guard placement, every camera angle, every shift in routine. Her awareness wasn't scattered. It was focused, deliberate, and precise. It was the kind of observation that didn't come from fear. It came from familiarity. That was the first thing that began to unsettle Lucien. He had expected resistance. If not outward, then internal. Small signs of adjustment, moments of uncertainty, subtle breaks in composure. But Alara showed none of it. Instead, she adapted, seamlessly. And that raised a question he hadn't anticipated needing to ask. Why? Why her? The selection had not been random. That much was obvious. But even within his own reasoning, there were gaps, details that hadn't seemed important at the time but now stood out with increasing clarity. Her background had been minimal, too minimal, verified but incomplete, enough to confirm her existence, but not enough to define it. At the time, that had been an advantage. Now it was a problem, because Alara Vance was not behaving like someone who had been pulled into this world against her will. She was behaving like someone who understood it. Lucien observed her closely during those first days. Not openly, he didn't need to. His presence alone ensured awareness. But his attention was constant, measured, and increasingly focused. He noticed the way she paused briefly at certain intersections of the mansion, as if anticipating what came next. He noticed the way her gaze lingered, not randomly, but with purpose. He noticed the absence of confusion. And most importantly, he noticed the absence of fear. That was the part that didn't make sense. Because fear was inevitable in his world. It was the foundation of everything he controlled. It shaped behavior. It dictated choices. It ensured obedience. But Alara Vance did not respond to fear the way others did. She acknowledged it, and then she moved past it. That alone shifted the dynamic between them. What had been designed as a clear imbalance, predator and prey, was beginning to blur into something far more complex. Because prey did not observe predators. Prey did not adapt to environments designed to break them. And prey certainly did not remain calm when surrounded by constant threat. Yet Alara did all three. The engagement itself became a spectacle, but not in the traditional sense. There were no celebrations, no displays of joy, no public appearances that suggested anything resembling happiness. Instead, there was control. Every detail was managed, every narrative carefully constructed. The world was told what it needed to believe, but never enough to understand. Alara's presence beside Lucien during official announcements only deepened the mystery. She stood with quiet composure, her expression neutral, her posture unshaken. She didn't play the role expected of her. She didn't appear submissive. She didn't appear defiant either. She simply existed beside him, unreadable, untouchable, and increasingly difficult to define. And that drew attention, not just from outsiders, but from within Lucien's own ranks. Because uncertainty, in a world built on control, was dangerous, and Alara Vance was becoming the embodiment of uncertainty. Days passed, but the tension did not ease. If anything, it intensified. The mansion adjusted around her presence, but it did not accept it. Not fully, because acceptance required understanding. And no one understood her. Not the staff, not the observers, not even Lucien, especially not Lucien. His curiosity, though controlled, was growing, not out of personal interest, but out of necessity. Unknown variables were risks, and risks, in his world, were eliminated. But Alara was not easily categorized as a risk, because she had not made a single move against him, not openly. And yet, something about her presence suggested that the game had already begun. The realization came slowly, not as a sudden insight, but as a pattern, a shift, a subtle disruption in the way things aligned. Lucien had built his empire on predictability, on understanding how people behaved under pressure. But Alara Vance did not follow predictable patterns, which meant one of two things. Either she was extraordinarily controlled, or she was extraordinarily prepared. And both possibilities led to the same conclusion. She was not what she appeared to be. The thought settled in quietly, but once it formed, it refused to leave. Why her? The question returned, stronger this time, not as curiosity, but as suspicion. And suspicion, once rooted, demanded answers. Alara, meanwhile, continued to move through the mansion with quiet precision. She spoke when necessary, remained silent when it served her, and revealed nothing beyond what was required. But beneath that controlled exterior, her awareness was sharpening, because something about this place was familiar, not in a way she could immediately define, but in fragments, details that shouldn't have mattered, but did. The layout, the structure, the rhythm of movement within the walls. It wasn't recognition, not fully, but it was enough to create unease. And Alara Vance was not someone who ignored unease. She followed it, carefully, quietly, without drawing attention. It led her deeper into the mansion, not physically at first, but mentally. She began connecting patterns, observing inconsistencies, noticing things others overlooked, until one moment, one small, insignificant detail, shifted everything. It happened in a corridor she had passed through before. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just another controlled space within a controlled environment. But this time, something felt different. Her steps slowed, her gaze shifted, and then she saw it. A detail so subtle it should have meant nothing. But it didn't, because the moment she noticed it, something inside her stilled completely, not in confusion, not in surprise, but in recognition. A recognition that should not have been possible, because Alara Vance had never been here before. And yet, standing in that silent corridor, surrounded by walls that were supposed to be unfamiliar, she knew with absolute certainty she had seen this place before, and she wasn't supposed to remember it. Some paths fade with time. Others are buried deliberately, hidden beneath layers of silence, altered records, and rewritten identities. And then there are paths that refuse to stay buried, no matter how carefully they were erased. Alara Vance's past belonged to the last kind. The moment in the corridor did not pass like an ordinary realization. It lingered. It expanded. It rooted itself deep within her thoughts, refusing to be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Recognition without memory. Familiarity without explanation. It was not the place itself that unsettled her. It was what her mind did in response to it. The way her body had slowed before she consciously understood why. The way her gaze had shifted towards something specific, as if guided by instinct rather than observation. That kind of reaction didn't come from nowhere. It came from experience. But Alara had no memory of ever being inside the Drax estate. At least, not one she could access. That distinction mattered, because absence of memory was not the same as absence of truth. She didn't panic. Panic required confusion, and Alara was not confused. she was focused. Her thoughts began to reorganize, pulling at fragments she had long ignored. Small inconsistencies, moments that had never fully made sense, details about her life that had always felt slightly incomplete. It started with her childhood, not as a clear narrative, but as pieces, disconnected, blurred, and uneven. She remembered movement more than places, transitions more than stability. There had been no single home, no fixed environment, just a series of temporary spaces that never lasted long enough to feel permanent. At the time, it had been explained simply. Circumstances, financial instability, the need to relocate. She had accepted those explanations because there had been no reason not to. But now, those memories felt different, because instability, she realized, had not been random. It had been controlled, carefully managed, as if someone had been ensuring that nothing and no one could trace her back to a fixed point. The realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, each thought connecting to the next with increasing clarity. And with that clarity came a deeper, more unsettling question. Who had gone to that much effort to erase a child's past? Ilara's attention shifted, almost instinctively, toward the one person who had always been constant in her life. Her mother. For years, she had seen her as fragile, vulnerable, someone in need of protection. Illness had defined her in recent times, reshaping her into someone who seemed far removed from anything dangerous or complex. But illness did not erase history. And history, Ilara was beginning to realize, was far more complicated than she had been allowed to believe. There were things about her mother that had never quite aligned. Small details that had been easy to overlook before, but now stood out with uncomfortable clarity. The way she avoided certain topics. The way she reacted, not with fear, but with immediate shutdown, when specific questions were asked. The way she had always insisted on staying unnoticed, disconnected, invisible. At the time, Ilara had interpreted it as caution. Now, it felt like concealment. And concealment implied something worth hiding. The connection formed quietly, but once it did, it could not be undone. If her past had been erased, then someone had been protecting her, or hiding her. And both possibilities led to the same conclusion. Her life had never been as ordinary as she believed. That understanding changed everything, because her past was connected to something larger, something deliberate. Then her presence in Lucy and Drax's world was not coincidence. It was part of a pattern. And patterns, unlike memories, did not lie. Elsewhere in the mansion, Lucy and Drax had reached a similar conclusion, but his approach was different. Where Ilara analyzed internally, Lucian investigated externally. The moment doubt entered his mind, it became action. Her background, once considered sufficient, was no longer acceptable. He required precision, certainty, complete understanding. So he began to dig. At first, the process followed familiar paths, official records, verified identities, standard data channels. Everything checked out, on the surface. But Lucian had not built his empire by trusting surfaces. He pushed further. And that was where things began to break. The deeper his investigation went, the less consistent the information became. Records existed, but not continuously. There were gaps, disruptions, periods where documentation simply stopped, not missing entirely, but interrupted, as if someone had allowed just enough information to exist to confirm her identity, but not enough to trace it fully. It was subtle, but it was intentional. And intentional gaps were far more dangerous than complete absence, because they suggested design. Lucian didn't react immediately. He observed, cross-referenced, repeated the process through multiple channels. The result was always the same. Ilara Vance existed, but her history did not in a way that made sense. And that was impossible. No one moved through life without leaving a trace. Unless that trace had been deliberately altered, the conclusion settled in with cold precision. Someone had rewritten her past, and they had done it well, too well. For the first time since her arrival, Ilara shifted from unknown variable to potential threat, not because of what she had done, but because of what she might represent. The question was no longer why he had chosen her. The question was who had positioned her to be chosen. And that distinction changed the nature of everything. Lucien's focus sharpened. His attention became more direct, though no less controlled. He watched her not as an asset, but as a possibility he did not yet understand, and that made her dangerous. Meanwhile, Ilera continued to move through the mansion with the same composed exterior, but internally, the pieces were aligning faster now, because recognition had evolved into awareness, and awareness was becoming understanding. It happened in small moments. A guard rotation she anticipated without realizing why. A structural detail she understood without needing to study. A pattern in communication that felt familiar, not learned, remembered, but not consciously. And that was the most unsettling part, because it meant her knowledge did not come from this moment. It came from before, from a past she could not fully access, but could no longer deny. The first time it became visible to someone else, it was accidental, a brief interaction, a minor detail, something that should have passed unnoticed. But it didn't, because Ilera reacted to a system within the mansion, not as an outsider encountering for the first time, but as someone who already understood how it worked. The correction she made was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Enough for one of Lucien's most trusted observers to notice. And in this world, noticing was everything. The information reached Lucien quickly, not as an accusation, but as a detail, a small inconsistency. But Lucien had already learned something important about Ilera Vance. There were no small inconsistencies, only hidden meanings. The pattern was becoming undeniable now. Her behavior, her background, her reactions. Individually, they could be explained. Together, they could not, which left only one possibility. She was connected to something deeper, something buried, something that had been meant to stay hidden. The investigation intensified, not publicly, not visibly, but thoroughly. Lucien moved beyond official systems, into networks that dealt in erased identities, altered histories, and buried truths. Places where information did not disappear, it was traded, protected, or concealed. It took time, but eventually something surfaced. Not a full answer, not a complete history, just a fragment, a name, one that appeared only once, briefly, before being removed, a name that had no reason to exist in connection with Ilera Vance. And yet it did. Lucien studied it carefully, because he recognized it, not immediately, but enough to understand its significance. It wasn't just a name. It was a memory, a distant one, tied to something that had happened years ago, something that had been resolved, erased, forgotten, or at least meant to be. The connection didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been possible, because the person linked to that name had disappeared long ago, removed from every system, every record, every trace, permanently, and yet here it was, connected, however briefly, to Ilera Vance. The realization didn't come with shock. It came with something far more dangerous. Clarity, because if that connection was real, then Ilera Vance was not just an unknown variable. She was a contradiction, a piece of history that had returned when it shouldn't have been able to, and that meant only one thing. The past he believed was buried was no longer buried at all. Lucien's gaze hardened slightly as he looked at the name again, not because he doubted it, but because he understood exactly what it implied and what it threatened, because some names weren't just identities. They were consequences, and this one should never have existed again, because the name tied to Ilera Vance belonged to someone Lucien Drax himself had ensured was erased years ago. A wedding, by definition, was meant to unite, but within Lucien Drax's world, unity was never the objective. Control was. And this ceremony, carefully orchestrated, meticulously executed, was not a celebration of love, but a consolidation of power disguised as tradition. By the time the day arrived, the city had already reshaped itself around the event. Movements were monitored. Territories went quiet. Rival factions, usually restless and unpredictable, held back, not out of respect, but out of calculation, because this marriage was not just personal. It was political. Every figure of influence understood what it represented. Aligning with Lucian Drax meant aligning with stability, protection, and absolute authority. Opposing him meant disappearance. And now, for the first time, that authority was being shared, at least in appearance. That alone was enough to draw attention. The venue reflected that power without ever needing to announce it. It was expansive, controlled, and designed with precision rather than extravagance. Nothing was excessive, yet everything carried weight. Security was layered, but invisible. The guests arrived in silence, their presence measured, their expressions carefully neutral. No one treated the occasion casually. Even those who held influence of their own understood that today they were not equals. They were witnesses. Alara Vance entered that space not as a bride, but as an unknown variable stepping into the center of a system built on certainty. And yet, she did not hesitate. Her appearance was flawless, but not delicate. There was no softness in the way she carried herself, no trace of uncertainty beneath the composed exterior. She did not look like someone being forced into a life she did not choose. She looked like someone who had already accepted the terms and was prepared to operate within them. That distinction did not go unnoticed, because submission, in its purest form, was visible, and Alara Vance was not submitting. Lucian observed her from the moment she entered, not openly, but with a precision that missed nothing. His gaze did not linger. It analyzed every movement, every pause, every detail. He had expected compliance. What he found instead was control. It was subtle but undeniable. She followed the structure of the ceremony without resistance, but there was no hesitation in her actions, no delay, no adjustment, as if she already understood what was required before it was presented to her, and that reinforced everything he had begun to suspect, because people did not adapt this quickly without experience or preparation. The ceremony itself unfolded with calculated perfection. Words were spoken, vows were exchanged, but none of it held meaning beyond its function. This was not about emotion. It was about legitimacy, about making something official in a world where perception was power. Alara stood beside Lucian, her presence neither overshadowed nor diminished by his. She did not attempt to match his authority, but she did not disappear beneath it either. She existed alongside it, and that alone shifted the balance in ways no one openly acknowledged, but everyone felt, because power, when shared even slightly, became unstable, and instability, in this world, was dangerous. The alliances behind the marriage were just as significant as the ceremony itself. Figures from different factions observed closely, measuring reactions, interpreting signals, searching for weaknesses. They found none, not in Lucian, and unexpectedly, not in Alara. Her composure held, her silence spoke, her presence resisted categorization, and that made her unpredictable. Lucian felt it clearly now, not as a passing thought, but as a growing tension beneath the surface of control he had maintained for years. He was not losing control, but he was no longer the only one shaping the environment. Alara's influence, though quiet, had begun to take form, and influence, once established, did not remain contained. The ceremony concluded without disruption, no mistakes, no visible cracks. To anyone observing from the outside, it was flawless, but perfection in this context did not mean stability. It meant concealment, because beneath the surface, something had already shifted, and both of them knew it. The transition from ceremony to aftermath was immediate. Formalities dissolved, structures loosened, but control did not disappear. It simply changed form. Alara's position within the Drax estate was no longer temporary. It was permanent, and with that permanence came access. At first, it was limited, controlled, expected. But Alara did not push boundaries aggressively. She did not demand authority. She did not challenge restrictions directly. Instead, she adapted, and in adapting, she expanded. Small permissions turned into larger ones. Observational access became functional understanding. Areas once restricted began to open, not because she forced them to, but because she moved through them without triggering resistance. It was not intrusion. It was integration, and that made it far more effective. Lucian noticed. Of course he noticed. Nothing within his domain shifted without his awareness. But awareness did not immediately lead to intervention, because he was watching something unfold, something he did not yet fully understand, and that understanding required patience. Ilara's behavior continued to defy expectation. She did not overstep, but she did not remain confined. She moved within the system as if she had studied it, learned it, and accepted it long before she ever entered it. The question returned, stronger than before. Who are you? Not in identity, but in truth, because Ilara Vance, as she existed now, did not align with the version of her that had been presented, and Lucien was no longer willing to accept inconsistencies. The tension between them shifted from external to internal. It was no longer about control over circumstances. It was about control over understanding. And for the first time in years, Lucien Drax was operating without complete clarity. That alone was enough to create something unfamiliar, not fear, but awareness. Awareness that something within his reach was not entirely his to control. The realization did not weaken him, but it changed the way he observed her. He no longer saw Ilara as a variable to manage. He saw her as a factor to solve, and solutions in his world required precision. But Ilara was not offering clarity. She was offering patterns, and patterns, when incomplete, were far more dangerous than answers. The final transition came with the night. The formal structure of the day dissolved into something quieter, but no less significant, because this was a moment where appearances no longer mattered, where roles shifted from public to private, where control was no longer observed, but tested. The space prepared for them was as deliberate as everything else. Controlled lighting, minimal design, no unnecessary elements, nothing that could distract, nothing that could conceal. And yet, something was already concealed. Lucien entered with the same composed presence he carried into every space. His expectations were clear, not in action, but in understanding. This was where the dynamic would finalize, where uncertainty would resolve, where Ilara Vance would either align with the role she had been given or reveal something else entirely. She was already there, waiting, not passively, not uncertainly, but with the same quiet control she had maintained throughout everything. And that was the first indication that this moment would not unfold as expected. There was no hesitation in her posture, no shift in her expression, no sign of internal conflict, only awareness, and something beneath it that resembled anticipation. Lucien stopped, observing her, not as a husband, not as a man, but as someone confronting a variable that refused to resolve. And then in that silence, something became clear, not through her words, because she said nothing, not through her actions, because she did not move, but through something far more precise, understanding, because as he studied her, her stillness, her gaze, her presence, he realized something that did not align with any logical expectation. This was not a moment she was reacting to. This was a moment she had already prepared for. Every possibility, every outcome, every decision, considered, calculated, anticipated. The realization settled with exact clarity, not gradually, but completely. Ilara Vance was not navigating uncertainty. She was operating within a plan. And Lucien Drax, for the first time in years, was not ahead of it. He was inside it, because on the night that was meant to define her submission, Lucien realized that Ilara had already predicted his every move before he even made it. The realization from that night did not fade. It settled, quietly, permanently. Lucien Drax had spent years mastering control over people, systems, outcomes. His world functioned because nothing within it moved without intention. Every action had a purpose. Every reaction was anticipated. But Ilara Vance had introduced something unfamiliar into that structure. Uncertainty. Not the chaotic kind that could be crushed or corrected, but controlled, deliberate uncertainty. The kind that suggested design rather than disruption. And once that kind of uncertainty entered a system, it did not leave. It evolved. From that moment forward, the dynamic between them shifted completely. This was no longer a situation of dominance and submission. It was something far more dangerous. It was strategy versus strategy, and neither of them intended to lose. Ilara did not announce her intentions. She did not make visible moves or challenge authority directly. Instead, she did something far more effective. She integrated, quietly, carefully, completely. The first layer of influence she established was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not actively looking for it. She observed the staff, not as individuals, but as patterns. Who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who held quiet authority despite lacking formal rank. Power, she understood, did not always follow structure. Sometimes it followed trust, and trust, once earned, became leverage. Ilera did not demand loyalty. She created it. Small interactions, measured responses, a controlled balance of distance and acknowledgement. She gave just enough attention to be noticed, but never enough to be questioned. Over time, that attention translated into something else. Access, not the kind granted formally, but the kind offered voluntarily. Information began to reach her, not because she asked for it, but because people felt inclined to provide it. Observations, irregularities, quiet concerns that had previously remained unspoken, and Ilera listened. She did not act immediately. She collected, organized, understood, because information, in its raw form, was useless. But information structured into patterns became power. Lucien noticed a shift, though not immediately in its full scope. At first, it appeared insignificant. A slight change in behavior among the staff, a subtle adjustment in how information moved within the estate. Nothing direct, nothing provable, but enough to trigger attention. And attention, in his world, led to action. His response was not confrontation. It was testing. Lucien did not challenge Ilera openly. Instead, he began introducing controlled variables, small disruptions designed to measure her reactions, unexpected changes in routine, altered instructions, conflicting information presented through different channels. Each test was precise, calculated to reveal inconsistencies or weaknesses. But Ilera did not respond the way he expected. She did not react impulsively. She did not expose gaps in understanding. She adapted, not perfectly, but intentionally, as if she recognized the test for what it was and chose how to respond accordingly. That alone confirmed something critical. She was aware, not just of the environment, but of him. An awareness, when mutual, transformed the nature of any conflict, because now every move carried weight, every decision held meaning, every silence became a statement. The game had begun, but neither of them acknowledged it, because acknowledgement would simplify it. And this was anything but simple. Beneath the surface of that controlled interaction, another layer of tension was forming, one that neither Ilera nor Lucien had created directly. The internal structure of the empire. For years, Lucien's control had kept internal threats minimal, not eliminated but contained. Loyalty, reinforced through power and consequence, had maintained stability, but stability, once disrupted, revealed fractures, and Ilera's presence had created disruption, not through action, but through existence, because her arrival had altered the balance of influence, and where balance shifted, ambition followed. It began quietly, a delay in communication, a misalignment in execution, small inconsistencies that, on their own, meant nothing, but together suggested something more, something hidden. Lucien detected it quickly, not the source, but the pattern. And patterns, once identified, demanded resolution, but before he could act, Ilera had already noticed, not because she was looking for threats, but because she was observing everything. The difference was subtle, but critical. She did not focus on disruption. She focused on behavior. And behavior, unlike actions, revealed intention. The shift came in the form of a single event, small, controlled, but deliberate. An arrangement altered without authorization, a pathway adjusted, a detail changed just enough to create vulnerability. Not obvious, but intentional. Ilera recognized it immediately, not as a mistake, but as a test, not Lucien's, someone else's. And that distinction mattered, because it meant there was a second game unfolding beneath the first, one that neither of them had fully accounted for. The response required precision, not exposure, not confrontation, but correction. Ilara adjusted her movements without drawing attention. She altered timing, redirected positioning, removed herself from the intended outcome without disrupting the system that had created it. The result was subtle. The attempt failed, without ever appearing as an attempt. And that was the most effective kind of defense, because it revealed nothing, but prevented everything. Lucian became aware of it afterward, not through direct evidence, but through absence. An outcome that should have occurred didn't. A disruption that should have escalated didn't. And the only variable capable of influencing that outcome was Ilara. The realization deepened his understanding of her. She was not reacting to threats. She was identifying them before they formed. And that required more than awareness. It required foresight, planning, preparation, which led to the conclusion he could no longer ignore. Ilara Vance was not surviving his world. She was navigating it, with intent, with structure, with purpose. The line between observation and action had already been crossed, and she had crossed it without leaving a trace. That alone elevated her from unknown variable to active participant, in a game where most people didn't even realize they were pieces. The tension between them intensified, not outwardly, but internally. Lucian's curiosity had evolved into something sharper, not suspicion alone, but recognition. Recognition that he was no longer the only one influencing outcomes. And that recognition did not weaken him. It sharpened him. Because if Ilara was playing a game, then he would not allow himself to fall behind. But even as that understanding formed, another development began to surface, one that neither strategy nor control had accounted for. The past, not Ilara's alone, but his. Because the deeper the internal investigation extended, the more connections began to emerge, connections that did not align with current structures, old alliances, old conflicts, old names, most of them irrelevant, forgotten, erased, but not all of them. Some histories did not disappear. They waited, and one of those histories had just resurfaced. It happened unexpectedly, a presence within the state, one that had not been active in years, not significant enough to be monitored constantly, but significant enough to be remembered. He had returned quietly, without announcement, without purpose that could be immediately identified. But his presence alone was enough to create tension, because he was not just anyone. He was someone who knew the past. And the past, as Lucian had begun to realize, was no longer as buried as he believed. The moment he saw Ilara, everything changed. Not gradually, not subtly, immediately. His reaction was not confusion, not curiosity, but something far more revealing, recognition. And beneath that recognition, fear, not the kind that came from danger, but the kind that came from memory, from something unresolved, something unfinished. Ilara noticed it instantly, not because she expected it, but because she understood reactions. And this one did not align with her identity, because he was not looking at her like a stranger. He was looking at her like something impossible, something that should not exist. The silence between them stretched for only a moment, but within that moment, everything shifted, because recognition, once established, could not be undone, and fear, once revealed, could not be hidden. Lucian saw it too, the reaction, the shift, the connection, and in that instant, the final piece began to fall into place. Not fully, but enough to confirm what he had already begun to suspect. Ilara Vance was not just connected to the past. She was part of something that had never truly ended, something that had been buried, but not destroyed. And now it was returning, right in front of him. Because the man staring at Ilara Vance wasn't seeing the woman standing in the room. He was seeing someone from the past he thought was long gone, and for the first time in years, he looked genuinely terrified. Truth, in Lucian Drax's world, was never absolute. It was constructed, controlled, revealed only when necessary, and often only in fragments. Lies were not the opposite of truth. They were tools used to shape it. But there were moments, rare, dangerous moments, when truth broke through anyway. And when it didn't clarify reality. It shattered it. The reaction from the man who recognized Ilara did not fade. It deepened. His behavior changed immediately, though he tried to contain it. Distance replaced composure. Avoidance replaced presence. But fear, once seen, could not be erased. And Alara Vance had seen it clearly. She didn't approach him. She didn't question him. She didn't need to, because his reaction had already given her something far more valuable than answers. Confirmation, not of who she was, but of what she represented. A past that had not been buried as deeply as it should have been, and a truth that someone had tried very hard to erase. Lucian, meanwhile, did not ignore what he had witnessed. He dissected it, every detail, every shift, every unguarded expression. The man's reaction had not been subtle. It had been instinctive, uncontrolled in a way that only genuine recognition could produce, which meant one thing. He knew her, or rather, he knew someone she was connected to, and that connection was not harmless. The name Lucian had uncovered earlier returned with renewed significance. It was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was a thread, one that now demanded to be followed. He moved quickly, but not recklessly. His investigation shifted from broad analysis to targeted reconstruction. He stopped looking for Alara Vance and started looking for who she used to be, or who she was meant to be. The process required accessing layers of information that had long been sealed, even to him. Old records, archived transactions, forgotten alliances that had once mattered, but no longer held relevance. At least, that was what he believed. Until now, the deeper he went, the clearer the pattern became. Not complete, not clean, but unmistakable. Alara's existence intersected with a moment in the past that had never been fully resolved. A betrayal, one that had nearly destabilized everything he had built. It had been handled quickly, decisively, without hesitation. Those responsible had been removed, erased, their connections severed, their identities wiped from every system that mattered. Or so he thought, because now, evidence suggested something else. Something had survived, not openly, not visibly, but carefully, hidden, preserved, and now returned. Alara Vance was not an accident. She was not a coincidence. She was a result of something planned, something patient, something that had waited years to unfold. The realization struck with precision, not gradually, but completely. He had not chosen her. He had been led to her. And that distinction changed everything. For the first time in years, Lucian Drax recognized a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider. He had made a mistake, not a tactical error, not a miscalculation in execution, but something far more dangerous, a misjudgment, because if Alara had been placed into his world intentionally, then someone had anticipated his actions, predicted his decisions, understood him well enough to manipulate the outcome, and that meant the game he believed he was controlling had started long before he realized he was part of it. The loss of control was not immediate, but it was undeniable, and control, once questioned, became unstable. Alara, meanwhile, was no longer searching blindly. The fragments in her mind had begun to align, not into full memories, but into direction. She no longer questioned whether her past had been altered. She understood that it had. The question now was why, and more importantly, by whom. Her focus returned to her mother, not as a source of comfort, but as a source of truth. Because if her life had been constructed, then her mother had not just been part of it. She had been central to it. The memories shifted again, this time with more clarity, not in full sequences, but in sharper fragments. A conversation that had ended too quickly, a warning that had not made sense at the time, a look, not of fear, but of urgency, as if her mother had known something was coming, something inevitable, something that could not be avoided, but could be prepared for. Alara understood it now. Her mother had not been hiding from danger. She had been waiting for it. And that meant her illness, her vulnerability, even her dependence, might not have been as simple as they appeared. The realization was not emotional. It was structural, because emotion clouded judgment, and Alara needed clarity. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligning, and at the center of that alignment was Lucian Drax, not as the cause, but as the destination. Because everything, her past, her placement, her presence, had led her here, to him, which meant one thing. This had never been about survival. It had been about arrival. And now that she was here, the next phase could begin. Lucian felt the shift before he fully understood it. Not in action, but in presence. Elara had changed. Not visibly, not in a way that could be easily defined, but in something deeper. Her stillness had become sharper, her awareness more focused, her silence more deliberate. She was no longer adapting to his world. She was operating within it, with purpose, and that purpose was no longer hidden. It was controlled, contained, but present. The tension between them intensified, not through conflict, but through understanding, because now both of them knew something the other had not confirmed. This was not accidental. This was not random. This was not simple. It was something designed, and design implied intention. Lucian's internal conflict began to surface, not outwardly, but within his own calculations. For years, he had trusted his ability to anticipate outcomes, to control variables, to eliminate threats before they fully formed. But Elara Vance did not behave like a threat. She behaved like a solution, and that was what made her dangerous. Because solutions were not always beneficial. Sometimes they were corrections, and corrections implied that something had been wrong, something he had done, something he had chosen, something he had ended. The thought did not sit comfortably, not because it created doubt, but because it created possibility. And possibility, when tied to the past, was unpredictable. Elara moved carefully now, not because she was uncertain, but because she was precise. She no longer explored. She targeted. The mansion, once unfamiliar, had become structured in her mind. Every pathway, every restricted section, every controlled access point. She understood the system. And more importantly, she understood where the system was weakest. It did not require force. It required timing. A single opportunity. A moment where attention shifted, where control loosened, where access became possible. That moment came without warning, but Elara recognized it instantly because she had been waiting for it. Her movement was quiet, unnoticed, seamless, not rushed, not hesitant, just exact. The pathway she chose was not random. It was specific, deliberate, and deeply connected to something she did not consciously remember, but instinctively understood. The door she reached should have meant nothing to her, and yet it didn't, because as she stood there, her hand pausing just before contact, that same feeling returned. Recognition, not of the place, but of what lay beyond it. Something important, something hidden, something that had been kept out of reach. Until now, Lucian, elsewhere in his state, felt the shift at the same time, not because he saw it, but because he understood patterns. And something had just broken, a line crossed, a boundary moved. He turned immediately, his focus sharpening with exact precision, because if Elara Vance had reached that point, then whatever lay beyond it was not meant for her to see. And yet, she had found it anyway. The final realization settled with cold clarity. This was not coincidence. This was execution. And he was already one step behind. Elara's hand moved. The door opened, and in that moment, everything changed, because what Elara Vance had just accessed wasn't just a hidden part of Lucian's empire. It was something that had the power to destroy everything he had built, including himself. Empires rarely fall from the outside. They fracture from within, not through sudden collapse, but through quiet shifts, a misplaced loyalty, a delayed response, a decision made too early or too late. And by the time the fracture becomes visible, it is already too deep to repair. The moment Elara accessed what was hidden behind that door, the balance of Lucian Drax's empire did not break. It destabilized, not immediately, not visibly, but fundamentally, because what she uncovered was not just information, it was leverage, the kind of leverage that didn't simply expose weakness. It redefined power, and power, once redefined, no longer followed old rules. The shift began subtly. Communication patterns altered first. Messages that once moved with precision began arriving late, or not at all, Instructions were followed, but not exactly. Orders were acknowledged, but not executed with the same certainty. To anyone outside the structure, it would have appeared insignificant. To Lucian, it was unmistakable. Something was wrong, not externally, internally. And internal instability was the most dangerous kind, because it meant trust had already begun to fail. He moved quickly to contain it, but containment required clarity, and clarity was no longer immediate, because the system he had built to function without hesitation was hesitating. Illyra saw it unfold with quiet awareness, not with surprise, but with recognition, because what Lucian was experiencing for the first time, she had anticipated long before it began. The information she had accessed did not just reveal the past, it exposed the present, connections that had remained hidden beneath layers of loyalty, alliances that had never truly dissolved, individuals who had waited, not for opportunity, but for the right moment, and that moment had arrived. The internal coup did not announce itself. It emerged through action, a shipment diverted, a directive overridden, a key figure suddenly unavailable. Each disruption small on its own, but together, forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Lucian responded with precision. Orders were issued, positions reinforced, communication channels secured, but the response for the first time was reactive, not predictive, and that shift, however slight, created space. Space for movement, space for betrayal, because betrayal required only one thing: opportunity, and Illyra had just created it, not intentionally, but inevitably. Her presence, her access, her influence, it had accelerated something that had already been waiting beneath the surface. The Empire was no longer stable. It was shifting, and in that shift, loyalties began to reveal their true nature. Some remained, firm, unquestioned. Others did not. The speed of that change was what made it dangerous, because loyalty, once broken, did not fracture slowly. It collapsed, and when it did, it took structure with it. Lucian felt it clearly now, not as a possibility, but as a reality. For the first time in years, his control was not absolute. It was contested, not openly, not completely, but enough to create vulnerability. And vulnerability, in his world, was never tolerated, except now it existed. Illyra stood at the center of that shift, not visibly, not publicly, but structurally, because the information she held had not yet been used, but its existence alone had changed everything. The question was no longer whether the Empire would fracture. The question was how far it would go, and more importantly, who would survive it. The pressure built quickly, not as chaos, but as controlled disruption, until control itself began to slip. The first open sign came without warning, a direct move, not subtle, not hidden, but deliberate, an attempt to seize internal authority, not from the outside, but from within Lucian's own ranks. It was precise, well-timed, and nearly successful. That alone confirmed what Lucian had begun to suspect. This was not spontaneous. It was planned, and it had been planned for a long time. Illyra understood that immediately, because the patterns aligned too perfectly to be coincidence, which meant one thing: the past she had uncovered was not just connected to her, it was connected to this, to the fracture, to the betrayal, to the moment unfolding now. Everything was converging, and at the center of it was a choice, not forced, not demanded, but inevitable, because for the first time since entering this world, Illyra Van stood in a position where she could influence the outcome directly, not through observation, not through preparation, but through decision. And that decision carried weight, more than anything before, because it was no longer about access or survival. It was about consequence. Lucian, for the first time, faced something unfamiliar, not defeat, but exposure. His position had not collapsed, but it had been challenged, and challenge in his world required immediate resolution. But resolution required information, and the one person who now held the most critical piece of that information was Illyra. The realization did not escape him. He understood it completely, which meant, for the first time since their paths had crossed, The balance between them had shifted, not subtly, not temporarily, but fundamentally, because now he needed her, not as a variable, not as a curiosity, but as a factor in his survival. And that changed everything. Ilara felt the weight of that shift, not emotionally, but strategically, because dependency, even partial, was power, and power, once obtained, had to be used carefully. The decision in front of her was not simple. It was layered, complex, because it extended beyond Lucian, beyond the Empire, beyond the present moment. It reached back into the past, into the truth she had only just begun to understand. Her mother, the betrayal, the erased identities, the years of silence, all of it connected, all of it leading to this point, which meant this was never just about Lucian Drax. It was about what he represented, a system, a decision, a past action that had consequences still unfolding. The choice became clear in structure, not in outcome. She could let the Empire fracture, let the betrayal complete itself, let Lucian fall, and with him, everything tied to him. Or she could intervene, stabilize the structure, preserve the system, and keep him in power. But survival was not the only factor. There was something else, something deeper, not emotion, not hesitation, but purpose, because Ilara Vance had not arrived here by accident. She had been placed, positioned, prepared, and that preparation had not been for observation alone. It had been for action. The question was, what kind of action? Lucian watched her carefully now, not as a superior, not as a strategist alone, but as someone waiting, because he understood something critical. The next move was not his, it was hers, and whatever decision she made would define everything that followed. The tension between them reached its peak, not through confrontation, but through silence, a silence filled with understanding, with possibility, with consequence. Ilara did not rush. She did not hesitate. She calculated every outcome, every variable, every path forward. And then she moved, not visibly, not dramatically, but decisively. The effect was immediate, a shift in alignment, a disruption in momentum. The internal coup stalled, not ended, but interrupted, just enough to change direction, enough to alter the outcome. Lucian felt it instantly. The pressure that had been building paused, not resolved, but redirected, which meant only one thing. Ilara had made her choice, but the nature of that choice remained unclear, because while her action had stabilized part of the structure, it had not restored control. It had changed the trajectory, but not revealed the intention. And intention was everything. Lucian's gaze remained fixed on her, not searching for answers, but recognizing something far more significant. He had not regained control. He had been given time, and time, in this situation, was not neutral. It was strategic, which meant Ilara Vance was no longer reacting to the game. She was shaping it, from within, on her terms. The realization settled with quiet precision. This was not loyalty. This was not betrayal. This was something else entirely, something far more dangerous, because it operated beyond both. Ilara turned slightly, her expression unchanged, her presence as controlled as ever. No explanation, no confirmation, no indication of what came next, only certainty. And that certainty carried more weight than any visible action, because it meant one thing. This was not the end of her move. It was the beginning. And as the Empire steadied just enough to avoid collapse, one truth became impossible to ignore. Ilara Vance had just changed everything, but no one, not even Lucian, could tell whether she had just saved him or set him up for something far worse. Every story built on power carries a hidden foundation, not strength, not control, but truth. And when that truth is concealed long enough, it does not disappear. It evolves. It reshapes itself. It waits. And when it finally surfaces, it does not simply explain what happened. It redefines everything that came before it. By the time the Empire stabilized under Ilara's calculated interference, the illusion of control had already fractured beyond repair. Lucy and Drax understood that now, not as a theory, but as certainty, because control was never about holding power. It was about understanding it. And for the first time in years, he realized he had been operating without full understanding. The silence that followed the failed internal coup was not relief. It was tension, a suspended moment where nothing moved. But everything had changed. Illyria Vance stood at the center of that silence, not as a victor, not as a savior, but as something far more unsettling. The answer, not to the present, but to the past. And the past, as it unfolded now, no longer belonged to Lucian alone. It belonged to her. The shift began with clarity, not revealed all at once, but with deliberate precision. Illyria did not confront Lucian with accusations. She did not expose the truth recklessly. Instead, she allowed it to surface in a way that could not be denied, because truth, when forced, could be resisted, but truth, when recognized, could not be ignored. Lucian saw it in the patterns first, connections he had overlooked, details he had dismissed, decisions he had made years ago, decisions that seemed necessary at the time, but now revealed consequences he had never fully accounted for. The betrayal. He remembered it clearly. A fracture within his early structure. A breach of trust that had threatened everything he was building. It had been handled swiftly, decisively, without hesitation. The individuals involved had been eliminated, their network dismantled, their existence erased. Or so he had believed. But elimination was not always complete, and erasure was not always permanent, because what Lucian had removed had not been the entirety of the threat. It had been only the visible part. The rest had gone unseen, unaccounted for, untouched, until now. Illyria's connection to that past did not reveal itself through emotion. It revealed itself through structure, through facts, through alignment. She was not directly tied to betrayal as an active participant. She had been something else, something far more dangerous. She had been the consequence, the child of a system that had been destroyed, the result of a decision that had been made without considering what would remain afterward. Her mother had not been a victim of circumstance. She had been part of that world, connected to that betrayal, not as the cause, but as someone caught within it, someone who had survived when others had not, someone who had disappeared, not out of fear, but out of necessity, because survival in that moment had required something more than escape. It had required silence and protection. Illyria understood it now. Her life had not been unstable by accident. It had been controlled. Every move, every relocation, every missing record, all of it designed to keep her hidden, not from the world, but from him. Lucy and Drax. The realization settled between them without being spoken, because it did not need to be. He saw it, clearly, completely, and for the first time, without control, because this was not something he could manipulate. It was something he had already set in motion, years ago, without knowing it would return. Illyria Vance had not entered his world by chance. She had been moving toward it her entire life, not consciously, not deliberately, but inevitably, because a truth once buried had a way of resurfacing in forms no one expected. And she was that form, the final piece, the missing consequence. Lucian's understanding shifted in that moment, not gradually, but entirely. He had believed himself to be the architect of everything around him, every decision, every outcome, every path. But now, standing in front of Illyria, he recognized something far more unsettling. He had not built a perfect system. He had built an incomplete one, and that incompleteness had created her. The power balance between them changed instantly, not through force, not through action, but through truth, because Illyria no longer stood within his system. She stood above the flaw in it, and that flaw gave her leverage no one else had ever possessed. Lucian did not resist the realization. He accepted it, because denial would not change the structure of what was already unfolding. For the first time, his position was not absolute, and that did not weaken him, but it changed him, because now he was no longer operating from certainty. He was operating from awareness. Illyria's final move was not destruction. That was what made it unexpected. She had the information, the access, the leverage. She could have dismantled everything, exposed the empire, ended his control completely. But she did not, because destruction was simple, final, predictable, and Alara Vance was not interested in predictable outcomes. She was interested in resolution, not revenge, not justice in its purest form, but something in between, something more controlled, more precise, more lasting. Her mother's fate became clear in that decision. The woman who had lived in silence, hidden beneath layers of protection and fear, was no longer part of the equation in the way she once had been. She was safe, not because the threat had disappeared, but because the system that created the threat had been reshaped. By Alara, the cycle had not been broken. It had been redirected, and that distinction mattered, because it meant the past had not been erased. It had been absorbed, transformed, integrated into something new. Lucian saw it for what it was, not an ending, but a transition, because Alara had not removed him from power. She had changed the nature of that power. Subtly, permanently, he was no longer the only force shaping outcomes, and he would never be again. The realization did not come with resistance. It came with acceptance, because for the first time, he recognized someone operating on his level, not beneath him, not against him, but alongside him, and that, in itself, was a shift no one had ever achieved. The silence between them returned, but it was no longer tense. It was defined, structured, understood. Alara had completed what she came to do, not by destroying the empire, but by rewriting its foundation. And in doing so, she had changed the game entirely. But even as everything settled into its new form, there was something that remained, unresolved, not in action, not in structure, but in possibility. Because truth, once revealed, did not end the story. It expanded it. Alara turned slightly, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. There was no triumph in her presence, no relief, no visible emotion, only completion, and something else, something quieter, something that suggested this had never been the final objective, only one part of something larger. Lucian saw it, not clearly, not completely, but enough to understand that while the past had been addressed, the future had not been defined, and Alara Vance was not finished. The empire stood, changed, stabilized, rewritten, but not concluded, because control had shifted, power had evolved, and truth had only just begun to surface. And as Alara Vance walked away from everything she had just reshaped, one quiet realization remained. This was never the end of the story. It was only the part she had chosen to reveal.